Zacznę, proszę Państwa, od takiego pytania bardzo wstępnego i bardzo też porządkującego chyba opowieść właśnie o tej znakomitej publikacji. Tutaj specjalnie akcentuję to słowo znakomitej, bo faktycznie, jeśli miałabym wskazać najciekawsze książki, które zostały przetłumaczone w ostatnich latach na język polski, to Kawa Hiena zdecydowanie byłaby jedną z tych książek. Jeśli Państwo jeszcze nie czytaliście, to zachęcamy, bo zapewne i autorka, i wydawczyni też się przyłączy do tej zachęty. Ale zacznę właśnie od pytania, które gdzieś lokuje tę opowieść, którą znajdziemy w książce, jako taką opowieść o mieście, Bratysławie, ale i opowieść o osiedlu Beczałka, osiedlu, które jest tutaj tym głównym bohaterem, tak można by było powiedzieć. Czy zgodziłabyś się z takim stwierdzeniem, że jest to w pewnym sensie historia miasta w mieście, tego osiedla, które szczególnie intensyfikuje takie doświadczenie miasta, ale tego miasta, którego często nie chcemy widzieć, nie chcemy dostrzegać, a zarazem jest ono udziałem tak wielu osób, bo przecież mieszka tam około 100 000 mieszkańców. Czy właśnie można by było tak tę historię skwitować jako opowieść o mieście w mieście, o takim trochę zintensyfikowaniu tego doświadczenia miasta?
I think it's one way how to see it, of course. The question is if the place which has the real name Petržalka and it is a housing estate in Bratislava is really authentic in a book like it is in a reality of Bratislava. I had a lot of talks about it with people who read the book and especially with people who are from Petržalka, and some of them were very upset about the image of the place where they live, because I think that the place is very peculiar, and what is interesting about it in reality is that actually there were projects which were never built or finished in this locality. Yeah? So one of them, the biggest one, was actually Bratislava subway or metro, which was projected in the 70s, and actually there is still a kind of line which goes through the Petržalka where the metro should have been structured underneath, but on the top there should have been kind of restaurants, bars, or some kind of places which should have been connected to the life around the metro stations. Yeah. So that was never built, but there is still this kind of corridor which goes through the Petržalka, but very few people remember why is it like that and why never there was nothing built in this path. Yeah. So what happened during those 30, or now actually 50 years, is that there is a wild nature there, and people now are protesting because now there should be a tram and a tram path or road exactly in this path, and there is a lot of refusion. People don't want it who live there because they've got used to this wild nature, which now they call park, which actually never was a park. It was never built by people or planted by people, those trees and the green, but it become their everyday walk place where they can go and go there walk the dogs and go for walks, and it has a kind of special natural, wild spirit. So people are trying to protect what actually come to the life because the plans were not fulfilled. So I think there are a lot of aspects of Petržalka which are very peculiar, and I think some people still would say that it's not such a monster that, like it is in my novel, but for me it was a monster, and one part of it was that when you live in this housing estate, you actually very rarely can be left in a quiet or in a silence, because you always, because of the construction from the concrete, which leads the noises very well, you always can hear what your neighbors are doing or talking. So you, after a while, I've got this feeling that it was a broadcast from every wall and from the ceiling and the floor too.
Bardzo ciekawe jest to, co opowiadasz, bo tutaj nawet w książce się pojawiają takie momenty, kiedy te chwile intymne, one się dzieją niejako wśród tych głosów właśnie dobiegających z zewnątrz. I jakby świetnie została uchwycona ta taka relacja jakby niemożności bycia razem, bycia samemu, bo w pewnym sensie jest się cały czas z kimś. Czy się tego chce, czy się tego nie chce. I człowiek jest cały czas rozproszony głosami innych ludzi, innymi ludźmi, nawet wtedy, kiedy jest skupiony, skoncentrowany na tym jednym bliskim człowieku.
Actually, I just have finished reading a book which was now published in Slovak translation, which is called The History of the Silence. And this book was actually, for me, it's a kind of old book because I think it was published the first time in 2008, so it's 15 years. But I was then preoccupied with this feeling of, when I lived in Petržalka for a while, I was preoccupied with this question of if the people have to have a right for silence in their life as a kind of human right for something. And this book, The History of Silence, brought me back actually to this feeling and question, because I think that it's more and more difficult to find places where people can be left in silence and quiet.
Tak, to się robi obecnie taki problem cywilizacyjny, ten brak ciszy, to narastanie tego hałasu wokół nas i też to, że my coraz częściej przyzwyczajamy się, czy tego chcemy, czy nie, że właśnie te różne głosy do nas dobiegają i w jakiś sposób cisza staje się doświadczeniem egzotycznym, tak można by było powiedzieć, czasami przynajmniej. Zastanawiam się też nad tym, czy ta pewna opozycja, która też się pojawia w Twojej książce, czyli taki podział między osiedlem a Starym Miastem, bloki a zamek, skazanie w pewnym sensie na mieszkanie w określonym miejscu i możliwość wyboru, poczucie bycia gorszym, poczucie bycia lepszym. Czy ten podział, który w dużej mierze jest podporządkowany topografii, związany jest z tym, że się mieszka właśnie albo na osiedlu Petržalka, albo nie. Czy ten podział topograficzny można potraktować też jako taki rodzaj metafory podziału społecznego, kulturowego, klasowego, czy też dałoby się właśnie tego typu wątki w jakiś sposób wyeksponować właśnie w kontekście tej topografii, która tutaj dominuje?
Of course, I do think about it in that regard too, because, for example, when people were asking me if I think that when the book was translated into other languages, and then brought into different cultures where people did know about what is Petržalka in reality, they can understand actually what I'm writing about. And I always said that, of course, because I think that Petržalka is something, it's like when you are, for example, traveling from the airports, very often you go through some parts of the towns which actually usually are those which are on the close to the airports, or like in a neighborhoods of the towns, where when people are looking at that, they think, oh, this is a place where I really wouldn't like to live. And that's what Petržalka is. It's the place where actually when you're looking at that, you feel that this is a place where you don't want to live. And the problem is that we are still building places like that. And of course, it's also part of it is that people who are rich, who have money, they can decide where they are going to live. They can get the places which actually, for example, in Bratislava, before were public places where you've got the very good view on the town, and now you cannot get back to those places because they are already houses built there. So I think it has this, there is this aspect in the book too, because the main characters are people who live a bit different life. They are probably artists, or I don't know, like people who are focused on other things than money. So I think you can feel that they are a bit actually out of society.
I don't know, because what is actually interesting is that there are people who are saying that they love to live there. So I think that for me, what is the problem is that the architecture is so austere, or for me shocking, that those big houses built of concrete, for me, I could never find a beauty in it. But there are more and more people who are trying, and I think it's part of it that there are people who were born there, yeah, and they lived all their life there. So like one of my last books is called Flaner's Shirt, 8.5 Bratislava streets, and it's about 8.5 streets of Bratislava. And I actually was thinking that I should also include one street from Petržalka, because I think it's such a special place, yeah? And I was thinking that I didn't want to be very personal in that book, even though every street starts with my kind of essay about the street, which is written from my perspective, but then there is like a lot of, the chapter is built from the dialogues and interviews and opinions of the people who live on the street, or who work there, or who are connected with the street, to capture the spirit of the street. And so I was kind of thinking that maybe I'm too personal when I want to go back to Petržalka and try to actually write about the street where I lived for a long time. And at the end I just thought that probably it can be okay if I do it like I did with all the streets. So I write my article, but then I leave the place for the people who live there to talk about it. And what was very interesting for me was that I was the only person who was actually negative about the place, and all the other people I interviewed were actually very positive, extremely positive. There was a young woman who actually told me that before she moved there, she was thinking that maybe she goes and lives abroad, or maybe some other place, not in Bratislava, but somewhere else in Slovakia. But then she said after she had lived for some time in Petržalka, she felt like this is the place where she wants to stay. And part of it is the land, the location of it, because
this part of Petržalka where this woman lives and where I have lived is actually very convenient and partly nice because of the landscape, because it's the part where you can just walk and you cross the Danube and you are in an old town. That's one thing, but while you are crossing, you actually have a very empty horizon, and you see actually the landscape of Bratislava like from nowhere else. So you can see actually the little hills which Bratislava is partly built on. You see the vineyards, you see the television tower. So it's actually, part of it is that you can see those the landscape, which is alright. It's just that what people build there is actually, I think, horrible. But I think that some people can maybe get over it. So I was actually very happy to write that I have this very negative feelings about this place, but I'm very happy that all those people who live there like it. Or all those people in my book.
W swojej książce piszesz o miejscu, gdzie czas nie gra roli. Mówisz o tym, że żyją tu stworzenia. Też się pojawia wątek możliwego odszczurzania przeprowadzonego właśnie albo po jednej, albo po drugiej stronie z racji właśnie rozdzielenia rzeką. Ale też się pojawiają twarze karaluchów, pojawia się głos sąsiada, wydobywający się nie z gardła, lecz z chłów bestii. Tutaj oczywiście cytuję. I mam właśnie takie pytanie o trochę pojawiający się taki wątek zdemonizowania i zarazem odrealnienia tego świata. Tak jakby ci ludzie w tej swojej bezradności w stosunku do miejsca, ale i też takiej bezsilności związanej z tym, że czasami łatwiej jest w grupie, bo tutaj też się pojawiają te grupy na przykład w jakichś skrajnych poglądach, prawda, gdzieś tam w tle jako pewien rodzaj zagrożenia, że właśnie ten wątek takiego demonicznego trochę świata trochę jak z horroru, zostaje tutaj jakoś też unieważniony poprzez tych bohaterów, których opisujesz, tych, którzy są jednostkami, a nie grupą. Czy można by było powiedzieć, że gdzieś na przestrzeni Petržalki trochę toczy się taka właśnie niepisana walka między tymi jednostkami, które próbują nie zostać bestiami, a tymi, którzy w jakimś sensie w tej anonimowości, symbolicznie oczywiście, jakoś tymi bestiami zostali. Oczywiście bestiami w tym rozumieniu, w jakim tutaj napisałaś, prawda? Czyli takiego trochę, no właśnie, odrealnienia, takiego trochę odczłowieczenia w tym sensie, że słuchamy tych głosów, nie wiemy kto to jest, to są też anonimowe często postaci, ta anonimowość też jakoś trochę odczłowiecza.
I think that the thing is that those main characters are not living, all of them in Petržalka. It's just two of them, the couple, Jan and Elsa. And the thing is that actually it's a bit like, for me, it was a bit like fairy tale, because Elsa is actually moving from Old Town to be with Jan, who lives in Petržalka, and she's at one point saying that she actually is trying to save him. And for me, it's like when there are those characters in the fairy tales who go to save someone's life. I think that the problem is that there are no groups in Petržalka, is that the people are actually isolated. They don't really know their neighbors, and that's the problem. That it's like, you know, the neighbors actually very intimately from what you hear, but otherwise you don't know them. Yeah, so people don't even greet each other. So, for example, one of the person who speaks in my other book, Flanner Shirt, about Petržalka, is a young man who is a photographer and who made a Baedeker about Petržalka, and he became one of those people who try to understand it and like it. And he actually told me that because I was trying to push him to say something negative about it, and at one point he said that he has to confess that when he was in his teenage years, he really had a problem that he lives there, and that when he was looking at that big concrete building, he said like, so this is the house where I was born, yeah, and the thing he then considered to do was that actually he started to talk to his neighbors he never talked to, and he made a special project, which actually I think it's still on the internet, when there is a photography of this big housing estate, part of the big housing estate, and you can click on several balconies and they open, and then you see photographies of the people who live there, and you see their living rooms. And he said that there was a moment when he actually changed his approach to Petržalka because he finally got to know his neighbors. So I think that's the issue, that there are actually no groups there, or before there was it that people just lived there, but there was the part of why Petržalka was not finished was that it was called actually the place where people just go to sleep. So there were no restaurants, cafes, libraries, bookstores. That part of the life or things which make the service which make people to stay and live in some area or place was missing, and still partly is. So there was no life where you could meet your neighbors. Yeah, everyone just went to his apartment and locked the door, and then unfortunately everything what was going on was possible to hear through in bathroom or in a living room of others. So I think it was a demonic place for me.
Dziękuję serdecznie i zapraszam na spotkania jutrzejsze.